Hi everyone. This evening we're joined by Lewis, who is one of the team at Russell's, which is an entertainment lawyer. So we're going to be chatting as a kind of a bit of an introduction into, I guess, how to be a bit more legally minded and what to consider when you're thinking about um, being given contracts or like going into collaboration sessions and stuff like that. For those of you that were in the session last night at Future Yards with Rough Trade, you'll know that my voice is kind of like ever diminishing this week. So hopefully it kind of stays till the end. But Lewis should be doing quite a lot of the talking anyway, so I should be all right. I'm going to bring Lewis in without further ado. Hi. Oh my God, my voice went really weird then.
Hello, you're right.
I feel like a pubescent boy. Like it's
Yeah, you sound like you've been shouting a lot.
no, just talking
Yeah,
incessantly all week, like
yeah,
absolutely relentlessly.
yeah.
I
Hello,
was
everyone.
almost contemplating putting a whiskey in this like ginger tea, and I just thought that
I'm surprised that you haven't. I've got some in here. I don't.
Yeah, I did have a little half a beer before I left work earlier. I do normally do this at Future Yards, but tonight we've got a gig on, we've got 5 bands rehearsing, and then also like a networking event. So there's absolutely no quiet corner of that building whatsoever. So I'm
Yeah,
back in the living room for this one.
yeah.
So let's crack on. This is my problem. I chat too much. So first of all, before we get kind of into all of the legal stuff, do you want to give us a bit of a background on you, Lewis, and how you've kind of come into doing what you're doing and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I am a solicitor at Russell's. Russell's, like Kath said, is a kind of music and entertainment industry specific law firm. And I am one of the solicitors here. So, kind of primarily, my main focus here is working with artists, kind of mainly emerging artists, and then hopefully as they kind of grow into successful, sustainable artists, you kind of go on the journey with them. So I've worked here for about 4 years. Prior to that, I worked at a record label in their business affairs team. And then before that, I did a bit of just random bits around music. I promoted some shows and was a failed artist, etc. Like everyone in the industry is, right? Everyone's a failed creative. I'm joking. But,
I always,
um,
I always think that's such a nice way in though, because I'm not like I've got absolutely no musical talent whatsoever. But
yeah,
sometimes I always feel like what lacks in the way that I work with artists is the fact I've never been one, is the
yeah,
fact that I haven't had that kind of experience. And as much as I feel like I can empathize with everything that like musicians go through,
yeah.
like I haven't actually been one. So I always see that as a massive plus if somebody has kind of taken that route into the music industry. I do see
Yeah,
strength.
yeah. No, agreed. But did you want to know what a music lawyer does? Was that
Yeah.
the prime of the question? Okay, fine. So that's a bit of a loaded one. Um, so so a lawyer in general, you associate lawyers, you go to lawyers typically when there is a problem or a transaction that you need. And I suppose music lawyers are a little bit different in that respect, which is kind of why it's a slightly odd concept. So I guess in broad terms, the core function of a lawyer, a lawyer as part of an artist team, is obviously the key things that you'd expect. So doing all of your legal work for you, negotiating. That typically looks like, I guess, just following the trajectory of an artist.
Mhm.
An artist might kind of start off doing singles deals or an EP deal with an indie label or something. They might need to sort out their management arrangements with a manager. They might start doing kind of longer form record deals, publishing deals, work with producers, mixers, samples, and all of that stuff. So all of those things we typically get involved quite early because as a music lawyer, you typically have lots of clients, and I suppose within Russell's is quite a big one of the bigger music law firms. So there's kind of a lot of shared knowledge within the building, which means a music lawyer can kind of typically tell you what the market rate and what the industry standard is with those kind of things. So kind of we'll do all of the paperwork on all of that, but we'll have a good idea about the kind of key commercial terms to go through when you're talking about a record in a publishing deal. I suppose as a music lawyer as well, just because of that relationship that you have again, which is you typically work across a lot of artists. You might also, so I look after a few kind of indie labels and publishers as well, and a few managers within the firm. We look after a whole host of people, music industry professionals as well. So I guess the slightly more soft skill that a music lawyer might be able to help you with is a bit more kind of general in your music business, especially as a kind of emerging artist. I think kind of a lot of what I'm referring to typically comes when an artist doesn't have a manager. Between the point that an artist doesn't have a manager and does have a manager, well, firstly, it's quite difficult in the modern day, I find, for an artist to get a manager, because managers are typically get 20% commission, and they need to be really involved in a project or see certain kind of like checkpoints that an artist has done before they want to invest in it, whether the music's amazing or typically kind of they want to see that an artist is doing stuff themselves a little bit, which kind of obviously means there's a bit of a gap where you don't have a professional advisor being able to help you with some of the, I guess, slightly more key things that you wouldn't necessarily know about within the industry. I mean, that might well be in itself be able to possibly help with, introducing you to certain people that you might need to as part of your team, so like managers themselves, or I guess giving you general business advice and guidance. But that's a slightly more soft skill that typically happens, and I think a lot of that is typically assumed by a manager once they start coming in. Once they come in, ultimately, I mean, we'll probably come onto this later, but typically artists that do really well sustainably over a career have a good idea of what's going on with their business itself, and so like I guess understand some of the key concepts of what's going on with their business itself, rather than just letting a manager sort that all out. But obviously there is an element of it, which is, as an artist, the primary thing that you want to do is be creative and have the time to be able to do that. So you do want to kind of give those responsibilities to someone else. But yeah, that's a little bit of interplay between those, I guess, slightly like ancillary things that a lawyer does. But yeah, I mean, the core function obviously is, negotiating and providing advice generally on commercial arrangements that you will enter into as an artist. And also that will wildly vary when you kind of become a more successful artist as well. The nature of a musician nowadays kind of transcends being a musician to an extent when you become a bigger artist, in that there's so much in the way of branding and endorsement and becoming a wider entertainment figure itself. So it kind of spans quite far. But I feel like I've gone on a tangent a little bit, but does that make sense?
Yeah, it was great. You've answered about 3 of my questions at once, so I didn't have to ask, which is always handy.
Yeah.
So you don't just represent artists, you represent artists as well as different record labels, as well as different managers. So it's not like a manager will have one type of music lawyer and then an artist would have another. They're all kind of represented by people like yourselves.
Yeah. So I think kind of, I mean, just to, I guess, come back to the way that Russell's is structured, because that might help contextualize a bit. So I don't think there's necessarily any like specificity in the knowledge that you have as an artist lawyer as compared to, say, like a manager's lawyer, for example.
Yeah.
Aside from maybe the fact that you do lots of deals, say, for example, you do lots of deals with major labels, you've got a little bit of a better idea about how to negotiate those, for example. But so within Russell's, there's a new artist team, for example. And so I'm kind of one of the members of the new artist team. There's about 6 of us. And then I guess as a contrast, there's a group of lawyers that do a lot of paperwork for the, for example, some of the major record labels as well. And they will have a kind of skill set, which is, they do those deals a lot of the time. So they're used to it a bit more. But I guess that there's not necessarily specificity necessarily between kind of an artist lawyer and a manager lawyer and a publisher's lawyer. There's obviously kind of bits that you need to learn, and within, I guess one of the reasons that music law, you kind of need someone specifically who knows about music or entertainment, is that because it's really complex and very based on industry knowledge. Like things like royalties, it's really hard to kind of, I don't know, just get a random lawyer from somewhere and expect them to be able to negotiate a deal for you, because a lot of the concepts are just really, specific to the industry itself. Yeah. As I'm sure is kind of like the way in, I think, a lot of entertainment industry law and I guess other areas, but yeah.
So it's different for different law firms, isn't it? That the kind of the way that they work with the artists, like financially as well. Like, how is a Russell's like basically, like if you start speaking to an artist before they've even got management and they've started to kind of get interest from like a small indie or maybe a publishing company or something like that, through to kind of that artist being a lot more established and having kind of more agreements coming through and maybe like signing bigger like long form like contracts and things like that. How does that differ for you? How do you work with those artists? Like, does it scale up in terms of how much they have to pay you, or like?
I think so. I mean, I can't comment on how kind of other law firms do it really, but I guess that the main kind of factors to think about firstly are, in general, lawyers are quite expensive.
Yeah.
And artists are generally broke. So there's obviously a problem there as to artists definitely need lawyers. I mean, at their earlier stages, kind of almost more than, probably at all times because it scales up. But there's certain things that you need lawyers for when you're doing deals. And as an artist, well, as a lawyer, it's impossible to work with an artist if you're pretending to charge your full fees to them. So, I guess kind of how it works generally, just thinking of examples, is that you often work with artists in good faith and typically you kind of get paid much less at the start. And the economics of it, I guess, are that you kind of grow with them, and at a point where they're able to afford, paying actual kind of full rate fees, which normally is at a point where they've done a big long-term record deal. That's typically when, or just generally when the artist can afford it. I think kind of that's the point where you start getting paid. But prior to that, I think kind of a lot of the time you do work in good faith, which I suppose from a kind of lawyer's perspective means that the economics of it are a little bit risk bearing, in that you choose to work with an artist and don't get paid as much as you normally would, and I guess which is why it's as a lawyer you have to be a little bit selective as to what you take on. I guess in the same way as it's very similar to kind of most areas of the music industry, in that everyone has a role to play within artist development, and everybody needs to kind of, I guess, take a risk in working with artists. I mean, if you look at a manager setup, for example, a manager will typically get paid 20% commission, and in the first 2 years they're working with an artist, it will probably be like 20% of like 50 quid, or like small bits and pieces here and there. But the nature of being an artist is that you suffer a little bit and grow your career sustainably, and there's no way we can work with artists if we're kind of not also coming on that journey with them. So that's kind of like the ethos behind it. And also it just wouldn't be possible to work with artists if we thought anywhere else, to be honest.
So it is like the same as other parts of the industry, where you do have to kind of invest some time
and
faith in those artists and those bands that they are actually going to like do something, basically, that they are going to kind of return on that like investment of time that you put into guiding them and helping them.
Yeah.
You mentioned it earlier, just about like, you know, artists early in their career need lawyers.
Mm.
At what point do you think that that is? Like, just to kind of specify, like, what kind of activity would be happening around an artist that would mean that they would need that kind of like solid legal advice, maybe more so than just like, when you starting to have conversations with somebody and you might get some help from, say, musicians union, or like, or if you're studying at a university and there's like maybe like a tutor or a lecturer that has that kind of like background, or when is it that you would need to actually just go, do you know what, I actually need to, like, someone on my side?
Yeah. Well, I think it's pretty much anywhere at any time where you kind of get into dealings with companies or people in the industry that are, I guess, outside collaborators and songwriters and things like that. And I suppose there's probably an exception to be said about, I guess, working with producers as well. But I mean, that's something I guess I've come onto in a little bit. But it is really useful to have a lawyer on board as early as possible. But kind of on the flip side, I guess from the lawyer's perspective as well, you'll kind of want to come on when there's kind of a prospect of things kind of happening for you commercially. / you might just actually love the music and be like, I want to help you and kind of give you some guidance in that respect. Although that then becomes slightly outside of the lawyer role itself. But I think probably at a time where maybe you start getting approached by third parties, whether that might be a manager or or labels or publishers. I think just to take an example, like if you're offered an independent label comes to you and says, right, we want to release your music, we want to do a 50-50 deal with you, which is that you're effectively sharing the profits of the record. We're not going to pay you in advance, but we'll spend all of that in kind of marketing and investing in you. Ideally, it'd be great to have a lawyer at that point, because they might take everything from you without you realizing. That's obviously an incredibly skeptical view of it, especially if it's like a nice friendly indie label. But and normally they're not, but I've seen pretty terrible deals before, which are like awful. So I mean, it's quite a tricky question to answer, to be honest. There's not an exact point in time, but I think kind of when you're starting to deal more and more with people in the industry and you're getting offers and things like that. I think there are particularly definitely times when you need a lawyer. For example, if you're being offered a formal management contract, if you're being offered any form of long-term deal for records and publishing, perhaps with a producer deal as well. I think. I mean, if you're doing a producer deal with someone who is paying you money or paying you a royalty, and you're expecting, I guess, at least a little bit of commercial success from it, then that's perhaps a time to do it. But I think there are definitive times when there is a very good time to do it. But other than that, it's quite a tricky one. Ideally, if you can get someone to do it, then ideally as early as possible. If you can find someone who'll help.
It feels a bit like what you're saying is like, the minute that somebody starts talking to you that might profit from you, that like might be like kind of taking something from you, like, so maybe not just like if you're just kind of like songwriting with your mates and stuff like that, but
exactly. Agreed. I think that's definitely a point where someone's looking to monetize your music. I mean, ultimately, music and music arrangements all really come down to like core principles, which is you're providing your rights to someone, in return they're providing you with money and services. And if the rights they're trying to take from you span quite a lot of recordings, or are intended to be for a long period of time, then there's more risk in it for you in not getting a lawyer to help out. Likewise, if there's lots of money exchanging hands, the more money there is, the more protection you kind of need in those situations.
Yeah, definitely. Callum's asked the question. I'm going to rephrase it slightly, is because obviously you represent like Russell's.
Yeah.
But you know, if an artist is looking for a lawyer, like what should they be looking for in that lawyer?
So I guess there's going through maybe a wish list then for that. So the core thing firstly is that they're a music lawyer. I mean that's kind of that goes without saying really.
That specialism straight there.
Like specialised in music or entertainment law, and there aren't a crazy amount of law firms that do that really. I mean, there's probably like 8 that I could like that if you got a gun to my head and said how many can you name in the next 10 seconds, I could probably come up with those. But other than that, there's not too many. There are some lawyers who work at, I guess, kind of more general firms that say they kind of specialize in music and might have kind of come from a musical background and be able to do that. So, I mean, the first thing is, doing your research and finding out which firms kind of offer that as a service. I guess the next step is, let's say you meet you're kind of sitting in a solicitor's office and sitting in a boardroom or something, and you're chatting with the lawyer. You want to find out, I guess, again, how they approach fees itself, because that's very important. Some kind of music law firms / lawyers will take the slightly less artist-centric approach with artists and be a lot more transactional and say, and in their heads, I think, say, I don't see this as a long-term prospect. This is kind of like a piece of work for me, so I'm going to charge you for every piece of work that I do. So I suppose, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it's not to say that the value of a lawyer providing their time isn't important and worth something for sure. But if you're going to get charged full whack for kind of every single piece of work that you do with a law firm, it's good to know about that before you start working with them, because you may well find someone who is happy to take you on a bit of a different and more good faith basis for sure. So those two things, and then if you kind of start getting to the I guess the wish list things, it might be kind of which artists that they work with, what kind of work they've done before. If you what experience does the firm have, I think as well is quite important. For example, I've been working at Russell's for about 4.5 years, and then before that I spent like 2 years in business affairs at a record label. So that's like six years experience. Mm-hmm. There might be a deal that you come across in the future where like you need a partner level person who has 30 years of experience, and it's a really complex transaction. You want to be able to pick their brains. It's quite good to have those people within the firm itself for sure. And then if you want to get really kind of wish list based, kind of the artists that the kind of artists that they do, I guess if they have a specificity of music that they work with. For example, like a lot of the clients that I've happened to work with are kind of within electronic music itself. So like, I don't know, if I was working with an electronic artist, that might be a tick for them. I think that's probably the main things off the top of my head.
Cool.
Yeah.
One of the things that I found over the years that isn't always like totally obvious to kind of more artists, like inexperienced artists, is the need for their lawyer to be independent from other members of their team. Like, can you tell us a bit about
that? So yes, it's important. So it's really important, and there's a few reasons why you should be able to trust a lawyer. Firstly, regulatory, the Law Society regulates lawyers, and we have a code of conduct that we need to abide by. And one of the key principles within that is you've got to act within the best interests of your client. And that's kind of like a key facet of like what we do. And we emphasize to artists when we work with them that often when an artist has a manager, we'll spend far more time speaking to the manager than them. But the key thing we always emphasize is, look, we work for you and not your manager, and your kind of the authority that we have is derived from you and not the manager itself. Management relationships, as an example, is kind of a common place where there are a lot of disputes in management relationships. And I guess the primary reason for that is ultimately you're kind of you're making a commercial arrangement with someone for their own personal services, and that's just really hard to contract for, because there's a lot of personal issues within there, as well as obviously a kind of like a commercial one as well. Managers, there are kind of lots and lots of reputable managers around. Some maybe less so. I guess the primary reason for that is, I guess if you think of it very skeptically, a manager takes 20% of kind of whatever you earn, and so arguably there might be more in it for them to perhaps take a higher advance and think about the current rather than the future a little bit more. That I'm not saying that happens very often at all, but it can happen.
I think it's a lot of pressure, really. If you look at kind of like the pressures of like some managers, like with those finances, of with like that kind of time it takes to build an artist up, and to make sure that those decisions that they're making around like what deal to sign, or whether to hold out for a relationship that's building with another record label or another publisher, and then somebody kind of like offers a deal that's got like a fat advance on it. There must be a bit of a pressure with certain people to just kind of like, we'll just go for it because we need that money.
Yeah, and to be honest as well, there is sometimes an argument for taking a big fat advance, and at the time, it's quite. I understand that pressure, and also like in general, the market is really tricky for managers. You get typically 20% of everything. You might end up coming to an arrangement where you actually pay your manager a bit more than that, which is becoming more and more common in the current day and age, primarily because artist self-releasing is far more kind of common.
More roles.
Yeah, your manager effectively becomes your record label, because again, so in a record label, you are typically getting 25% on the pound. Whereas in a distribution agreement, that might go way up to 85 pence on the pound. But again, like I mentioned before, it's all about what rights you're providing, and then the money that you're getting paid and the services that you're being provided. And obviously, if you're getting 80% of the money, you can't expect all those services. So a distribution/label services deal will kind of give you basic functions of maybe a little bit of promotion, but otherwise in those situations you and your manager have got to be the record label in that respect. And so there's lots more pressure and lots more that a manager needs to do in the current day, for sure. So that's why I guess management arrangements, there is a little bit of change in those now, which if you think of it kind of is perhaps there for sure. But how do we get here from that?
We're talking about the importance of your lawyer
objectivity,
not representing your manager at the same time as you, or representing record label.
Ultimately, you want to be able to feel that, because of the fact that, for example, you might have a manager that you really, really work closely with. You might work with your record label a lot. You might have a whole host of contributors that you work with, and it's important to know that you have someone who can be an objective soundboard to help you out with certain situations. And kind of where I got to with the management thing is kind of often because of the nature of that management relationship, managers come and go quite a lot, and typically a lawyer sticks around for like a long period of time and oversees that whole process. And yeah, it's incredibly important to have one of those people in your team itself. And I guess the primary thing, a kind of a good illustration of that as well, is comparing UK music lawyers to US music lawyers. US music lawyers, they take, rather than getting paid fees based on the work that you do. Normally when we do a record deal or something like that, we say, we charge per hour, we estimate it's going to be this much. Normally you can get the record label to pay for it.
Yeah.
So that's great. But in the US, what they do is take 5% of your gross income or 4% of your gross income, which is insane. Just so much money.
Feels like very much like what Rebecca Ferguson's campaigning against as well is, like, have you seen what she's campaigning against? With like,
I should know.
She's basically making sure that artists know that, like, not to make sure that their lawyers and their accountants are separate from their management company or their record label. Because what's happened with a lot of the X Factor contestants is that with X Factor, you've got to kind of basically sign on the dotted line in order to get further in the competition.
Yeah.
And the lawyers that are giving them the advice on it are within the same company as the management company. And that's what, that's what she said. I don't know, like, I don't have first-hand experience of it. But,
I don't know about those arrangements. So she's
campaigning against it really, really heavily to make sure that people know. And there was a breakdown of like an artist accounts which saw that the lawyer was taking like revenue from royalties, basically, which is exactly
that's very unusual.
How they do it in America. I was just like, that's how they did it on the X Factor as well.
Yeah. Look, we're not allowed to do that by the Law Society. The Law Society specifically prevents us from taking a commission. So like,
good to know.
Guess that illustrates like why we don't take commission on in that respect. Because if the Law Society thinks it's not in the client's best interest to be able to work in that way, because you might prejudice your client's best interests, then that's why we don't work that way.
And that makes perfect sense. Like, like that you're not compromising the integrity of that kind of relationship by like making decisions or like guess kind of giving an artist advice that would be in your favor. That would make absolutely perfect sense. I've got a question here which I think's quite an obvious one. Any suggestions of ways to find law firms and where to begin? I mean, your like Russell's is rosters on the website, isn't it? So you can just Google.
No, it's not. It's not on the website. No, it's not. We've got like. Let me see the website actually quickly. Typically, law firms don't put like the roster on the website itself. I guess we wouldn't necessarily call it that, but like, we don't typically try and kind of derive, reputation based on our clients.
Right.
I think because the music industry is quite small. Typically, a lot of the clients that we work with come through recommendations through other kind of industry professionals. They might have kind of emailed in kind of to the main website, and we might have kind of like picked it up or might have emailed us personally, but we don't typically have those on our website. That being said, there's like we've got a news thing which talks about all the news going on, and various artists are mentioned within that itself. So
you can gauge a little bit, like.
For sure. But no, I think kind of the answer to that probably is just to the question at hand. Probably, I think just Googling. To be honest, a good old Google never goes wrong.
One of the things that I used to remember from way back when I started working in the music industry is that lawyers would be on to artists before anyone. Like they would invest in A&R teams, and like I had a mate that was a A&R for a law firm and used to get so many tips when I was like working at a PR agency on because it was just like he knew about stuff before anyone. Is that still the case?
A bit, yeah. I mean, so I guess kind of in that respect, the reason why that happens is because lawyers often are one of the first ones in the process of, forming an artist team. A kind of industry, kind of because we are, I guess, not necessarily scouting, but I guess to a sense we are really like you're looking for artists to work with who you really like their music and you want to work with them kind of on a long-term basis for that kind of, I suppose, like risk element in the hope that they have a sustainable career and you're able to guide them through that and makes you really happy. And when then they've got Christmas #1, then you're doing lots of work for them and you're getting kind of the benefit of that too, sure. But to be able to work with those artists, you do typically have to find them quite early because a lot of the time, I mean, just to take a practical example, if an artist is starting to get a bit of an industry buzz, i.e., if good managers are starting to take note of them, labels are starting to get in touch with them and have chats with them. Often, one of the first questions they'll ask is like, "Who's your manager and who's your lawyer?"
Yeah.
And if they don't have one, then they'll typically kind of get referred to, us or another law firm, or they'll make recommendations saying you need to get a law firm on board. Also, part of it is that it is actually a little bit, to an extent, it's a bit competitive in that, like, whilst there aren't too many music lawyers around, obviously you kind of want to work with like good artists, and so in the same way that a record label looks for artists and does all of that, then like I guess a music lawyer does that too. So like, and in order to kind of know that you want to work with a good artist, you'll go to see gigs, for example, or go to see gigs to like either see an artist or kind of meet kind of industry professionals or both a little bit. So there's very much kind of a network of, I mean, the music industry is quite small, I think. I haven't worked in it that long, but like the more I spend time in it, the more I realise how small it is. And I suppose there's kind of like a network of people that you tap into and know and come across here and there quite a lot. And
there's a lot of crossover, isn't there? There's a lot of crossover. There's always like people will share a team member, like an artist will share a team member with another artist, and
So that's the reason why I think that happens. It seems a little bit counterintuitive, like a lawyer going out looking for like emerging artists to work with, but that's the reason why.
Right, I'm gonna flip it now and take the focus away from you onto artists.
Yeah.
So artists, maybe like before they've started speaking to like prospective lawyers and stuff like that, and they're kind of just getting their shit together, and like they might be self-releasing some music, doing gigs and stuff like that. They might have done a few songwriting sessions. They might have kind of met a couple of producers along the way. What do you think are the key things that those artists have to consider that might trip them up later on from a legal standpoint?
So I think I could probably go over all of those little elements in turn, really, to be honest. But when you're collaborating with other artists, especially with mates as well, often it feels like you don't need to get any formal paperwork involved, and realistically, you probably don't, because an agreement doesn't need to be a formal signed agreement in Times New Roman with like loads of weird archaic language in it. Like any written email can often just be a binding agreement. So, to be practical, when you're doing songwriting, for example, with other songwriters or artists, obviously the main thing to kind of have a red flag over is talking about splits until you've done the session itself. Normally, it's very much a case of with writers working together, you just go in and vibe together and make something, and then kind of like work it out work it out after as the splits over an email. And I think kind of working that out and agreeing it over email is kind of the best way, and pretty much more or less the only way that you need to protect yourself in that respect.
Cool.
Artists and writers are able to formalize kind of splits pretty easily, and once it's agreed in writing, each of the writers can go into PRS and put their respective shares on when it's released, and kind of receive money directly for that. There are some instances where you can get a little bit screwed over by other artists if you've done a writing session and then kind of other people come along and change the songwriting quite a lot. It's a tricky one. It's becoming more and more common for like writers to use, like artists to use like lots of different writers. But getting splits in email is quite important in that respect. Going over to like producing and working with like producers. Producers is a little bit more tricky to work with. I think as a producer yourself, I think it's really important to have a basic idea of how you're going to be working with an artist and what you are going to be getting from it.
Yeah.
Often a producing / songwriting thing will kind of happen in one same room. You know, the both are the same. Someone might be at a laptop producing and both people are songwriting at the same time. So you know, if you're going together and doing a songwriting session, there's no need to kind of like get necessarily formal about it. But as soon as you're engaging someone to do some work on your music, it's important to make sure whatever you agree again is in writing somewhere. Often at least an email with 5 or 6 bullet points saying, "Here's what we've agreed for this, and you need to pay me this or a share of receipts." I think typically with producers, if there are kind of artists who haven't necessarily released music together and they're wanting a producer to work on their music, or an artist which is quite small wanting a producer to work on their music, it's a tricky one to know how much to pay a producer, because ultimately you don't have any money. So like, but the producer's time is worth money. So like, how do you remunerate them? And often the case is if you can't pay them up front, what you do is pay them a little bit of you pay them a bit of a bigger chunk of the pie up front and say, look, I'm going to give you 25% of my net profit or something like that until you've made X from it, and then, you know, maybe we'll move to a normal producer relationship. So collaborating can be quite informal, but also it's quite important when you're kind of doing dedicated work for someone to make sure that you are firming all of those terms. So yeah, producing and songwriting, I think those are covered.
What you're saying is like there isn't necessarily a necessity to kind of like put down a formal agreement in those
no.
That everyone knows what's been agreed and what everyone's relationship is in that scenario, and it's all very, very clear. Or anything happens to that song or happens to that track, as
always the case is, whilst, you know, not trying to formalize anything, obviously, you know, protecting yourself by having something in writing is the best thing that you can do in absence of having a formal agreement. And so you know, if you've done a songwriting session with someone, then it's probably quite useful to, you know, work out splits fairly short after, if you've actually finished the song and said, right, who's done what on it. And typical rule of thumb there's not necessarily a typical rule of thumb, but often people see it as 50% is for the actual kind of underlying music, and then 50% is for the lyrics and lyrics and top line. And so if you kind of work it out that way and say one person's done that and one person's done the other, then that's straight 50-50. If someone's done both of them and one person's done a little bit, then obviously it makes sense to reduce it a little bit. It's kind of more of a whatever feels fair in that respect. There's such intangible concepts to work out. I think in that respect. But Yeah, having things in writing, important.
What would be your reaction if an artist came up to you and said, this person has, like, say, for example, as a manager, like, what would be your advice if an artist approached you and said, I've been for a meeting with this manager, they seem like the right fit, they've given me this contract?
Don't sign it. Most, if not all managers won't put management paperwork in front of you for at least 6 months for when you've been working with them. You need a trial period. Both parties kind of need a bit of a trial period to work to be able to work together, and it just doesn't make any sense to do a management agreement before that. So most managers who have worked with artists before kind of get that concept, and probably won't provide you paperwork. If in that situation they have provided you paperwork, then you're probably well within your right to say, I'd much prefer to just see how this relationship is going on informally for us before we do that. I guess the logic behind that really is if you would need a lawyer to get involved with management paperwork. It's very important that both the manager and the artist really should have a lawyer doing that for them. And the reason why it doesn't make sense to do that right at the start, because you might not be a good fit, and management paperwork typically is kind of expensive to do because it's one of these hotly contested negotiations, which are often like subject to a lot of arguments, like I said before. So you need to actually put a bit of time and thought into it. So it doesn't make sense everyone's spending money on that when you don't know how that relationship's going to work. Specifically because if I was an artist lawyer and in that situation, the artist said, "Fine, let's crack on and negotiate the paperwork." The first question I ask is, "How long have you been working with them?" If they say, "Haven't worked with them yet, but they've put management paperwork in front of me," I'd say, "Well, if there was insistence that we get the paperwork done, then I'd put a 6-month trial period clause in, which says any party can leave this agreement when they want to within 6 months." So if that's going to be the case, then just don't do it and kick that back. Another important point I've mentioned about management agreements is that broadly, it's always in the manager's interest to have a management agreement formalised than an artist's. And that's primarily because, I won't get into it too much, but that's primarily because of a thing called post-term commission. When you're working with a manager, that's called a term. So, and the term of that of your management agreement is when your manager they're your exclusive manager. You're working together. You might be creating records, writing songs, and everything that you do within that relationship is kind of within the term. You might agree a fixed 3-year period. You might agree something else. And then after that term's finished, so you stop working with them and you're free to go off and do other things after that, and you might be able to find another manager. Within that 3-year period, everything that you made within that time, managers typically expect a certain amount of commission after that term, and that's called post-term commission. Managers don't generally have that entitlement until they've got you in writing saying, "I will give that to you." And that typically is like the primary driver of a manager looking to do a management agreement. So that's a little bit of context. Obviously, like, it's totally reasonable for a manager to expect to be able to be paid in that way, because the value of your work isn't just solely within that period that you're working with them. You as an artist get to benefit from that music and those songs forever. And if a manager's helped you with that, then why shouldn't they be able to benefit from that too, even when they've stopped working with that with you? But that's just something to think about. Management agreements typically always in the manager's favour, which is also one of the reasons why often managers might kind of contribute towards your legal costs in getting that done as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I used to, when I first started working with artists kind of more directly than just doing PR and like putting records out,
Yeah.
I'd always kind of like tell them to follow their gut feeling, and I realized really like pretty quickly that the gut feeling is just sign whatever gets put in front of them for many different
Yeah.
reasons. Like, and I don't mean this as any slight towards those artists that I'm thinking about, because I know that there's anxieties that go through your head
Yeah.
that, you know, if I don't do this, they won't want to work with me, or this might be my only chance, and like,
Yeah, for
or
sure.
the
Yeah.
chance I squander it and I don't get another good one. But it just like for me, like particularly with that kind of management thing, I once had like somebody in the space of a year that showed me 3 different management agreements for 3 different people.
Yeah.
And I was just like, where are you meeting these people? It just it's such a red flag.
Without meaning to generalize, I would probably, without meaning to generalize, I'm about to generalize. If a manager insists on you signing a contract from day dot, then I'll probably treat that as a red flag, because
Yeah.
most all reputable managers know in the industry that doesn't make sense to insist on that
No,
for anyone.
it tells me that that person hasn't managed anybody before
Yeah.
and doesn't know much about how that relationship is built up. Because
Yeah.
like as much as that, you know, an artist might not want to be kind of like tied to a manager if it doesn't work, it's the same way the other way around as
Yeah.
well.
Totally.
If that
Totally.
breaks,
Yeah.
if that relationship doesn't build into a real relationship of trust and like, you know, like an equal appreciation, then that's not going to work, is it?
Yeah. Exactly.
You've got to feel your way in that.
Yeah.
Like, is there any kind of like particular red flags in that in general with like kind of contracts being issued early, or like just like,
I guess
maybe small indie labels, maybe
Yeah.
that's probably a good one, isn't it? Like single deals and things like that. That
So-
maybe it's come from maybe that it's come from like a small record company that's been set up in a local, like your local city, and they've
yeah.
a template from the internet or something like that.
Yeah. Modern Sky or something like that. I'm joking.
You said that, I didn't.
No, I'm messing. No, I was just thinking like locally to you guys actually. Ish. So
They're a lot bigger than what I'm thinking, Modern
yeah,
Sky.
no. Yeah, they've grown quite a lot. So if you're looking at all right, as a general principle, as an emerging artist, you might get offered a single deal or something where a label is offering you really shit terms. They're going to take your rights for fucking ever, and they're not going to pay you very much. But what they are going to do is they might be a reputable label that's going to invest in your service and provide services to you.
Yeah.
There are often times as an emerging artist where you kind of have to maybe do a deal which is like a bit crap, but at least you know that you're getting services and you view it as a stepping stone onto a bigger thing. Now, the absolute key thing, the key caveat to that is the amount of commitment, or the amount, the length that you're going to be tied into that deal, or the amount of product commitment that you are required to provide. If you're being asked to provide 1 or 2 singles, then I guess that's not very much in the grand scheme of life, especially if you back yourself as an artist. Whereas if you kind of read through it and they say we're going to have an option where we can do an album with you, or we can do 3 albums with you, and the upfront kind of amount that we're going to pay you is like 5p, then then those deals are the ones to be extremely cautious of. The worst thing you can do as an artist is getting to a long commitment deal, which is where you're locked into a contract until you've provided lots of products, and the label has the ability to exercise options where they can call for further commitment from you. So that's probably the most key thing I can think of, more than royalties or advances or anything like that. Anything that stops you from being able to release with other labels That's
Yeah.
really important.
I guess it doesn't just stop you releasing from other labels, but it could potentially just stop you growing.
Yeah,
Like,
totally. It will cause you to stagnate. The wrong kind of deal will cause an artist to stagnate. That's why it's incredibly important to think strategically. This is kind of where we where we get involved as well. Like, think strategically about who you're doing a deal with and how long it's going to be for. What does that look like in practice? If it's an album deal plus another album, where does that take you to in your time period? You've got to be quite strategic about these things, but long-term deals are a major red flag, which you think about very carefully. And then other than that, other things to think about very small kind of single deals. A problem might be that a singles label, which only does records, might want to take your publishing as well. I'm kind of seeing
yeah.
that more and more. And just
I'm seeing that loads. I'm
yeah,
seeing it in like record deals
yeah,
where like there's in the actual kind of like the contract of a record deal,
yeah,
there's like one part of it is the publishing.
yeah. No,
Like
no,
just
you
like it's like
don't
there
do
in
that.
that thought. It just like blows my mind that's
Yeah.
kind of started to happen. I'm glad
So
you've said that.
that's a tendency that I'm starting to see a little bit more from the indie labels perspective. They'll What they'll say is, well, like, it makes sense for your kind of publishing to be with us because we'll be
Yeah.
able to collect it. You might not have a publisher yet. We'll be able to collect, like, I mean, just I guess to back up here a little bit. If you don't have a publishing administrator or a publishing administrator, by the way, is very easy to get. You can get one online. But if you don't have someone collecting your certain types of publishing for you, then you can't access them. So you need to have someone appointed for you to do that. We can come on to that in a bit if you've got a question on that. But the label might say, we'll do that for you. Also, with doing your publishing as well as the masters, then we'll like be able to do more sync, for example. They might give all these reasons as to why it's a good idea, but it's not a good idea because
No.
a record label and a publishing company are two totally separate ideas which do totally different things. And ultimately, what typically how it works as an artist, unless you're kind of like a bona fide writer, but as a kind of recording artist and releasing artist, typically you will make music, release a lot of it. No publisher will kind of come to you and do a deal until much later in your career, where you're actually releasing a lot of music and your songs embodied on those recordings are generating money on their own.
Yeah.
At which point you can get a good publisher who might be able to provide you with really great services or give you like a fat check for all of that work. But you're not able to do that if, like this indie label says, every single record that you make, you also give away the publishing.
Yeah.
Two totally different income streams, and so it should totally be separate. And I haven't seen really any argument yet to be able to justify why a label should take that. To be
I've
honest,
seen it.
the
The examples of it that I've seen it happen is that the record label that's offering it, has basically done a deal with one of the administrators, like Centric or Song Trust, which
Yeah.
are mostly representing the independent artists anyway. And
Yeah.
they've basically got these administration deals, and then they're doing some sync pitching alongside it. So it's just added in as that kind of afterthought because that record label has done it.
That's a
Has done
tricky
it
one.
with an administrator.
I guess on the one hand, from a label slash publisher perspective, sure, there is more impetus for you as a label slash publisher to try and get syncs for music that you control more of a share in,
Yeah.
So in that sense, looking at skeptically, like, it might make sense to do that. But
It does for the label though.
yeah,
So
but
if a
yeah,
label is taking a bigger percentage of your publishing royalties,
yeah.
it's using the same service that you're already using that are only taking 20%.
Well, like,
It's mad.
by giving both your records and publishing to a label where they might have like one internal sync person, what additional service are you actually practically getting by doing
You're
that?
not. Because you're not. You're
Yeah.
just giving them a bigger percentage of your publishing, aren't
Yeah.
you? It's
So the
mad
thing,
that it's happening. It's mad that I'm saying it more and more, and I'm so pleased that you brought that up because I
yeah,
think it is something that people really need to consider. Is
yeah.
that your publishing isn't just another line in a record deal? It should be a separate contract in
It
itself.
is a separate right, and you know there may be instances where you want to do that, or you need to do that, or you're under pressure to do that, and like probably if you had a lawyer, they would maybe fight the point quite hard. But
Yeah,
if it's an absolute term of you doing that deal with them, then make sure it's an exception to the rule and it doesn't happen very often, because ultimately if you do that with all of your single deals that you do, then you won't have any publishing to be able to go off and do a publishing deal with later on.
yeah.
You know?
Do you think there is any other areas that artists can like commonly slip up on things like this? Like, do you think that is there anything that you see, like maybe that when you're talking to the kind of more like artists on the newer scale
Yeah.
that
Um,
they might have kind of dealt with that's kind of like commonly something that we should be aware of?
I think it's a tricky question. I think kind of the ones I've the ones I've gone over are probably like the most key points that kind of like instantly spring to mind in that respect. I think anywhere where you see um, different rights being granted, you need to stop and question it. Whether that
Mhm.
might be, in a record deal, we might see publishing rights or live rights or anything like that.
Or merch, like
Or
cuts on
merch
merch
as
and stuff
well,
like
like
that.
a percentage of merch as well. Typically, like only the major labels take a cut of that, and they started taking a cut of it because the music market crashed in like
Yeah.
the 2000s, and they said, "Crap, we're not making any money off records. We need to take ancillaries. Ancillaries are live merch, branding, everything else."
Uh-huh.
And now that the music economy is doing very well again, they're not letting them go. So what's a man to do? It's a major label, you know. In some instances, you're able to like really like fight the point, but that's only when you've got an incredibly competitive deal. Nine
Yeah.
times out of ten, if you're doing a deal with a major label, you don't really have that much leverage. And it's the 1 out of 10 where like lots of them want an artist at the same time. That's when you
Mhm.
have a bit to play with. But
Yeah.
I've strayed off point a little bit. I think to be honest, I think management agreements just don't sign them without a lawyer straight up.
Yeah.
Don't sign them. I kind of one of the worst cases of an artist signing something that they shouldn't have was there was an artist with quite a lot of buzz. He was kind of like making kind of he was making really good music at the time. I'm not going to go too specific here, but um, he signed he signed something which gave his manager his publishing and records
Right.
uh, at the same time, and the amount of time that we spent trying to get him out of that deal, it was literally a one-page agreement which says, "I'll own this, this, and this. I'll own your
Yeah.
records, I'll own your publishing, I'll be a manager." And it took us so long to get him out of that deal that he couldn't do anything, and he was like incapacitated for ages. And that was really tricky. And actually, another one I've just thought of actually is production deals. Uh,
Okay.
production deals are when someone comes and says to you, "Hey, here's this contract, right? I'm going to offer you studio time, and I'm not going to specify a budget, but I'm going to offer you studio time and develop you as an artist. We're going to do a 50-50 deal, already sounds reasonable, whatever." But
Great.
it's not, because most of those production deals are really old school. A production deal in this modern day and age, it's questionable as to why it still exists. I mean, if you do a production deal with someone who's going to um, invest in you and I guess be your manager to a certain extent,
Mhm.
and kind of pitch your music to record labels, that
Yeah.
is more or less a traditional modern day manager. And
Yeah.
when you've got kind of good management, especially kind of a good management setup, sometimes they're able to access funding for you, or in most cases they'll be able to do a small deal where someone pays you 5 or 10 grand and you can get some money in to do it. But there are production deals which I see every now and then, and these are things that often come in through the Russell's kind of traditional email when people email in and say, "Hey, can you help me with this contract?"
Yeah.
Typically coming through those, and we see a like the most evil looking contracts where it's like there's been no money being put up front. A very important concept is life of copyright, which
Yeah.
is where you're giving your rights to someone forever.
Yeah.
In those deals, typically life of copyright, they're all life of copyright deals itself, and they're typically quite long term. So you need to treat those with a lot of caution, I think, as well. If someone says production deal and you read through it and it says, "I'm going to develop you and like make you into a superstar, but I'm going to take your shoes and everything from you in order to do it," then like, yeah, those are bad ones.
Cool.
Yeah.
Is there any tips that you can give our artists on just being more kind of like aware in general of like where kind of information is shared, or like anything to kind of keep up with that might help them just kind of like look after themselves a bit, I guess?
Um, I think they're like for I guess for music law itself, it's very much a skill, and it's not necessarily to say that you go off and negotiate your contracts yourself, but learning kind of key terminology about like what kind of certain things mean and how things are calculated and how a typical agreement works is I think really important just to get like a basic level of understanding
Yeah.
of of how commercial deals work in music. Um, like I said before, I'll come to say it again. Like the building blocks really are um, you're giving away rights, which will often mean you're um, creating a product, creating assets, creating recordings, photos, maybe videos,
Hmm.
and you're giving them to someone for a certain period of time. What are you getting in return for that? You're getting services and you're getting money for it. And the balance of services versus money is always always needs to be proportionate. Um, for example, a kind of I kind of say it's a little bit old school now, but like the idea of getting a 20 and 25% royalty from from a label means that they're keeping 75% of it, or 80 to 75% of it. And what are they doing with that money itself? I would probably probably go as far as to say that not many labels can justify doing that model because they're
Yeah.
not established enough to be able to provide all of these core marketing services that you're getting when you're giving away a lump sum of your money away. But I guess understanding kind of like the core principles itself, a key thing I guess as well is like understanding just the revenue flow of money and where the money comes from itself. I mean
Hmm.
that I think that's really really key. You need to understand you have two separate rights. I can't touch on this before, but you've got
Lewis,
you,
don't worry, we've done that.
yeah,
We've done some sessions on.
recording rights and publishing rights, and with both of those, there are two totally different income streams, and the way they kind of flow down from say Spotify or from being played at the local Greg's are different. But having an understanding of those and making sure you're properly registered for local collection sites is quite key as well. And yeah, I think kind of being legally and commercially minded like is something that the artists, which I think probably have done like I don't know, I don't have a crazy amount of experience. I've only been doing it for so long, but just it seems to me that the ones who are a bit more savvy tend to do better in the music industry, really. So it is quite important. There are like a couple of good books that you can read on it as well. Like there's one that's called like All You Need to Know About the Music Business, which is by Donald Passman. There's another one by Anna Harrison as well, but I can't remember what it's called. It's probably
Yeah.
something about music law um, in the title. But yeah, understanding, I guess, key terms, key terminology, key concepts, and
Mhm.
how that relates to the money itself is like, really important to know and understand.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you
Sweet.
so much, Lewis. That's been brilliant. That was really, really great. Um,
Lovely.
if anyone's watching and needs some kind of like advice on making sure that you've got all your rights sorted and that you've like registered all your tracks correctly and all of that stuff, book in a mentor session with Grace because she's boss. And yeah, and she'll be able to help you out with all of that. I know that she's watching now as well, so like she'll be dead happy with that. We're going to follow next week with another Lewis, but we're going to talk about finances and getting all of that sorted as well. So that'll be the same time next week. But in the meantime, thank you so much, Lewis. That was so boss. We'll have to get you up to Birkenhead at some point, which
Yeah,
we've
that's
been
all good.
talking about for ages now, but it'll happen.
Yeah, it'll happen. It'll happen. No problem at all.
All right, cheers. Right, nice one. Bye, everybody.
Bye.